Hi, welcome. My name is Charlotte. I love colorful and sparkly makeup. I'm currently on a no-buy, and here on my channel I just like to play around with makeup without centering buying new things. I like to be a little bit critical of the capitalist frenzy that is the makeup market right now. If any of that sounds interesting to you, I would encourage you to subscribe to my channel, like this video if you like it. Today I'm going to be attempting to dupe a very old palette, which is the Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde palette. Please excuse my nails. I don't usually do anything to my nails, and I tried giving myself a manicure. I'm now regretting it because this like old chipped mess here is so much worse than just having nothing on my nails, which is a lot easier. So please just ignore these. There are certain palettes that I look at and I'm like, yeah, okay, I definitely have all those shades. It's just very obviously, straightforwardly dupable from my collection. This was not necessarily one of those palettes, particularly because it has a lot of purple tones in it, and I just don't wear a lot of purple or own a lot of purple, especially not like really special purples. But I think I got decently close with my version. I did go ahead and pick out these shades already, but I am gonna swatch the palette, talk you through the shades I chose, and we'll see how close I got. Some of them were definitely not obvious, but I think I'm kind of getting the vibes. I just really love this color story, and it looks a little bit chaotic right here, but especially within the packaging of those big 18-pan Huda palettes, which I just find so like luxurious and attractive for some reason, even though it's like got her face on it, which is like does weird me out a little bit. For whatever reason, I just find this palette like really just delicious to look at. And I've been finding myself especially attracted to it this time of year. I think this is a really beautiful color story for taking you sort of from winter through Valentine's Day and into spring. It's got these lovely springy pastel tones. These two in particular just look so much like those Valentine's conversation hearts to me. And it's got like some icy, wintry kinds of tones, as well as obviously a lot of Valentine's-y kinds of pinks. And like the golds in this palette are kind of unexpected to me, so I think it's a really beautiful color story. I was never really that tempted to buy this palette because I think looking at it, like, yeah, I like looking at it, but I didn't think that I would get a ton of use out of it, I guess. And it is sort of like an improbable combination of colors in some ways. But I have to admit that while looking through the swatch photos and everything to do this dupe, I was more tempted than I had ever been to actually buy this palette, and I was somewhat disappointed to find that it seems to have been discontinued. At least I don't see it for sale. But I mean, yeah, at the end of the day, I have this dupe. I'm excited to use this combination of colors together. It's just as well for my wallet, for my no-buy, that this seems to no longer be a temptation on the market. You might hear my cat in the background, by the way. She's really trying to get me to like do laser pointer time with her. So the first shade in the palette is called Cosmic, and for this I chose the shade Pixie Dust from Looxi. Cosmic, I believe, is like a taupery kind of shade, and it's also a more cool toned pink. Pixie Dust is an interesting one because it is cool toned for the most part, but it has like almost a yellowy gold shift. So I don't know if you can see that. It's a really beautiful shade, but the gold shift combined with the cool pink sometimes makes me not know what to do with it. I think that the Huda one is maybe like more on the silvery side than gold, but there is gold in this palette. So I think this Looxi shade would actually go really well with this color story, so I am excited to use it. The next shade is just this light orange matte, one of those conversation heart shades. And in the Huda palette, it's called Utopia. I went with a shade from the ColourPop Fade into Hue palette called Treasure. Now the purples were where I had the most trouble duping, I think. This one is called Ultraviolet in the Huda palette. I chose this shade from the Glamlite Ghostface palette, which is called Sharpest Knife. It's a really, really beautiful kind of sheer shade. And it has like different colored sparkles, so you can see like a sort of blue paired with a kind of bluish purple, and it also does have, I don't know, it has like almost a green shimmer and like maybe a pink shimmer as well. It's really, really beautiful. And I think that works just fine, although it's not an exact dupe of the Huda palette. This one was a little bit more challenging. This is called Nebula, and in the Huda palette it's described as like a kind of glittery shade. The one I have is much more smooth, and it's called Steel. It's from the Beauty Bay Midnight palette. It was the closest thing I had in tone, but I really don't have any super, super sparkly, glittery purples. So this wouldn't necessarily serve the same function in a look, but I could always top it with one of the toppers. Like, even this one could be a topper for this darker purple. Mercury was so different in swatches from what I had actually expected just from looking at the pan. And I was actually sort of expecting something more like this. This shade is, here, I'll swatch it. This is Gin from the Glamlite Dirty Martini palette. That's a sheer layer, but you can build it up into like a really opaque sort of, you know, I don't know, sea green, aquamarine, like a turquoise, I guess. The one in the Huda palette is much more muted, more blue. So I think it's actually much closer to this shade from Looxi called Nightfall. And actually Nightfall I think is like a little bit more golden and warmer than the one in the actual Huda palette, which seems to have just sort of like a deep sheer blue base with like a jewel toned teal shimmer on top, I guess. But you can see the difference in these tones, I think. Like there you can definitely see the difference in the base tones. Yeah, that was just an unexpected shade for me. Thought that was very mildly interesting. Anyway, I'm gonna swatch out Nightfall for you here. Beautiful, beautiful shade. Now, I will say that was the shade in this palette that made me want it, because I realized it wasn't what I expected it to be, and it wasn't as easy to find in my collection as I thought. But that's part of the tricks your brain plays. It's like you don't need every single variation of tone just because you don't have it in your collection. Anyway, this next shade is called Haze in the Mercury Retrograde palette. I chose the shade Seltzer from the ColourPop Mint to Be palette. I think that one is a pretty close dupe. Next is the shade Off Balance, and I went with a shade from the ColourPop Fade into Hue palette called Lovecraft. This might be more vibrant than the one in the palette, I'm not sure. I don't have a ton of like cool toned pinks, so I decided to go with something that was definitely more cool toned, even though it might not be the right like value for the palette. I'm not totally sure. This next shade is called Galaxy, and it's a kind of silvery pink. I went with the shade Fire Hunt from Devinah, which you can see is super, super glittery. And I think, honestly, that is probably the texture that this purple shade was supposed to have. But obviously, it doesn't. This shade is really wild, I have to say. The shade Libra is just a very cool toned, pinky, lilac-y kind of shade. I chose to dupe it with the shade Fancy from the Beauty Bay Midnight palette. I believe that's what that shade is called. Crash is like a kind of dusty, mauve-y purple, I think. At least that's how I interpreted it. And so I have this shade Big Moves from the ColourPop Making Mauves palette. I just love that shade so much. This is Momentum in the Huda palette. It's just a pretty basic like cream toned shade, I think. Okay, it's not even showing up here, but this is Bonafide. It's from the ColourPop It's a Mood palette. Honestly, I wouldn't choose to have a space taken up in a palette by a shade like that, but there you go. This next shade is a topper, and it's called Supermoon in the Huda palette. I had seen it described as like a white shimmer, So I don't have something like that. The closest thing I have would be the Fenty Diamond Bomb in How Many Carats, which is just like a sheer white kind of sparkle. But I chose to go for my single shadows with this shade Midnight Robe from the Glamlite Ghostface palette. And it is a silver, but when you sheer it out, it just turns into those kind of silver white sparkles. I think this would be perfectly serviceable as this kind of white topper shade. But swatched out like that, you can see it does have like a gray silver base, just slightly. But it still works really well as a topper. And it's just a stunning, stunning sparkly shade. Yeah, I'll have to give you a close-up look at all of these swatches in a moment. Moving on to the last row, this is Vortex in the Huda palette. I went with another shade from the Making Mauves palette from ColourPop. This is called Marquee. It's kind of a dusty plum, almost winey kind of shade. This pink matte looks like just sort of a raspberry tone, like raspberry ice cream kind of, in the Huda palette, and it's called Hot Mess. I duped it with this shade, what is this called? Shake It Up from the ColourPop Strawberry Shake palette. My swatches are getting a little messy, but you know what I mean. Okay, now this is Supernova in the Huda palette. This is the kind of like warm pink, orange, gold, bronzy kind of shade that Huda seems to have in a lot of their palettes. Like all those like naughty nudes, new nudes, whatever nudes. I honestly love this kind of tone, and I have had my eye on those palettes. But I do have this shade. This is from the Oden's Eye singles, and it's either called Ivy or, yeah, I think it's called Ivy. This is not like my dream version of that shade. It does have this super, super warm orangey base, but the shimmer on it is sort of like a cool toned magenta, which I personally just don't love wearing, but I think it's pretty close to the version of those shades that is, you know, here and in those other palettes. There, you can see the shift there a little bit. This is just a peachy matte called Karma in the Huda palette, and I used the shade Irish Cream, I think. Yeah, Irish Cream from the Glamlite Chocolate Martini palette. Alright, I didn't really save room for these, but let's see how we can do this. Oh, I'll put them maybe here on my wrist. There's two more shades. This is Gold Glitch, and I just chose a pretty middle of the road gold. This is called Penny. It's from the Beauty Bay Earthy palette, and I think it's really beautiful when it's like sheared out. I think that's the best way to capture what I think the Huda gold is doing. Admittedly, shearing it out looks kind of like nothing in a swatch, but in person it looks pretty. I can just build that up a little bit just to show you more what the tone is. And then finally there's this more bronzy kind of gold, which is called Frazzled. And for this, I was hesitating between a couple of shades from the Chocolate Martini palette, but I ended up going with this one, which is called Rich. Nope, sorry, this one's called Cheers. You can see it just has like a bronzy kind of base with a pretty basic middle of the road gold shimmer. All right, let's see if we can capture these shimmers. This one here is looking a little bit brown in the context of the entire palette. It is like, I guess, a slightly warmer purple. I'm trying to decide if I should replace it, but I think I'm gonna leave it. Because I think the other purple I have in this value, I think is just gonna be a little bit too like vibrant for this palette, whereas this is sort of like each of these tones, aside from maybe the pastels, I think each of these tones is leaning toward a neutral version of itself. That's why I do think that this bright pink here is like a little bit much compared to what you actually see in the Huda swatches. Okay, this is borderline cheating, but I did build this pink shade up in my swatch, so I'm just gonna go back in with like a sheerer layer, and yeah, I think that's just gets closer to the shade I'm trying to dupe. It's like the world's strangest looking swatch because it's just like a little bit, like a little misty, a little foggy there, but I think that gets at the vibe. The closest thing I have to that actual pink tone would actually be one of these Huda shades from the Rose Quartz palette. Probably either this one, Happiness, or this one, Cherished. But I wanted to pull these out of my singles, so. So there you have it. This is my dupe of the Huda Mercury Retrograde palette, 4 years too late. I may actually film some looks with this. I mean, I always kind of think that to myself when I build a BYOP, but maybe this time I'll follow through. As always, I hope this is interesting, fun, or inspiring. If you have this palette, this is a great time of year to pull it out. If you don't, maybe you want to dupe it like I did, or maybe there are other palettes that you're duping at home. Let me know, and other than that, I will see you soon in my next video. Bye!